August 14, 1945, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, Japan. The war was already over, but no one had told the men inside Hangar 7. Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Yamada stood in the darkness of the underground facility, watching as shipwrights applied the final layer of cypress wood to something that should not exist. The submarine before him was made almost entirely of wood, hinoki cypress, the same sacred timber used to build Shinto shrines. It smelled of forest and resin, not oil and steel. In the dim light, it looked less like a weapon of war and more like a coffin built by monks. The Type U-1 prototype measured only 19 meters long, a midget submarine designed to carry 2 torpedoes and a crew of 3. But what made it different from every other submarine in the Imperial Japanese Navy was that it had been engineered to be invisible. Not to the human eye, but to the acoustic detection systems, the sonar, that Allied destroyers had used to hunt and kill hundreds of Japanese submarines throughout the Pacific War. Wood produced almost no sonar reflection. On an enemy's hydrophone, this vessel would sound like nothing more than a drifting log or a school of fish. It would be a ghost beneath the waves. Yamada had been transferred to this project 3 months earlier, pulled from his post aboard a conventional I-class submarine after it had been bombed in port. He had watched 12 of his men burn alive in that attack. Now he had been given a second chance, or perhaps a suicide mission disguised as innovation. The Navy's high command was desperate. American B-29 superfortresses had already incinerated Tokyo, Hiroshima, and Nagasaki. The fleet was destroyed. Fuel was almost gone. Japan's last hope, they told him, was unconventional warfare. Silent attacks launched from wooden submarines that could slip past destroyer screens and strike Allied capital ships at anchor. But Yamada did not believe in hope anymore. He believed in physics, and the physics of a wooden submarine terrified him. The hull was laminated hinoki cypress, reinforced with a thin inner skin of rubberized canvas and sealed with pine resin. It was lightweight, which meant it could submerge quickly, but it was also fragile. A single depth charge detonating within 50 meters would shatter the hull like a porcelain vase. The ballast system used lead weights instead of flooded tanks, which made depth control unpredictable. The electric motor was a salvaged unit from a torpedoed cruiser, prone to overheating. And the periscope, a hand-polished German-made Zeiss optic, had been installed crooked. During the first test dive, it had flooded, nearly drowning the engineer. Still, Yamada climbed aboard every morning and ran drills. He memorized the way the wood groaned under pressure. He learned to read the submarine's moods, the way it creaked when descending too fast, the way the hull sang when the motor strained. He became obsessed with making it work, not because he thought it would win the war, but because he needed to prove that he had not survived his old crew for nothing. On the morning of August 14th, orders came down from Naval General Staff Headquarters. The prototype was to be prepared for immediate deployment. Target, American Task Force 38, reportedly anchored off the coast of Sagami Bay. Yamada read the orders twice, then looked at his crew. Petty Officer Hideaki Tanaka, a former fisherman who could hold his breath for 2 minutes, and Seaman Hiroshi Nakamura, 19 years old, who still wrote letters to his mother every night, even though the postal service had stopped running weeks ago. That evening, as the sun set over Yokosuka, they loaded 2 Type 97 torpedoes into the wooden submarine's forward tubes. Their torpedoes were old, pulled from a warehouse, their guidance systems corroded and unreliable. Yamada did not inspect them closely. He did not want to know how likely they were to malfunction. At 2100 hours, the U-1 was towed out of the harbor by a small fishing boat and released 3 kilometers offshore. Yamada ordered the dive. The ballast weights dropped, the wooden hull groaned and tilted forward. Water rushed over the deck, and for a moment Yamada thought he could hear the forest again. Wind through cypress branches, the sound of rain on temple roofs. Then the periscope went dark. The depth gauge stopped working, and from somewhere deep within the hull, beneath the motor housing, came a sound that did not belong. A slow, rhythmic knocking, like someone trapped inside the wood, trying to get out. Yamada felt his throat tighten. Tanaka looked at him, eyes wide. Nakamura whispered a prayer. The submarine was still descending, 15 meters, 20 meters, 25 meters, but the knocking grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the cramped interior like a heartbeat that would not stop. And then, all at once, the lights went out. August 15th, 1945. 0200 hours. 30 meters beneath Sagami Bay. In the absolute darkness, Takeshi Yamada counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. The air inside the wooden submarine was already thick, tasting of resin and sweat and something else, something ancient and damp, like the inside of a temple that had been sealed for 100 years. The knocking had stopped. The motor had stopped. The only sound was the creak of laminated cypress adjusting to the pressure of the sea above them. Tanaka's voice broke the silence, steady but strained. "Commander, the battery junction has shorted. I can bypass it, but I need light." Yamada fumbled in the dark until his hand found the emergency lantern mounted near the helm. He cranked the handle. A weak, flickering glow filled the cabin, casting shadows that moved like living things across the wooden ribs of the hull. Nakamura sat frozen at the torpedo station, his face pale, eyes locked on the bulkhead where the knocking had come from. "There's someone inside the wood. I heard them. They were trying to get out." Yamada wanted to tell him it was just thermal contraction, that wood behaves strangely under pressure, that there was a rational explanation. But he had heard it too, and he could not explain it. Instead, he turned to Tanaka. "How long to restore power?" Tanaka was already pulling apart the junction box with a screwdriver. 10 minutes, maybe 15. The insulation is soaked through. Whoever salvaged this motor did not test it for saltwater resistance." Yamada nodded. 15 minutes. They could survive 15 minutes. The air was still breathable. The hull had not cracked. They were 30 meters down, too deep for surface detection, too shallow for crushing pressure. They just had to wait. But waiting in a wooden submarine felt like being buried alive. Yamada had trained for mechanical failure, for torpedo malfunctions, for enemy attacks. He had not trained for this. The feeling that the submarine itself was aware of them, listening, judging. He ran his hand along the inner hull. The wood was warm. He told himself it was from the motor. He did not believe it. Nakamura spoke again, quieter now. "Commander, do you think the Emperor will surrender?" The question hung in the air. Yamada had heard the rumors. Everyone had. 2 atomic bombs, entire cities erased in seconds, Soviet forces pouring into Manchuria, the Supreme War Council meeting in emergency session. But no official word had reached Yokosuka before they deployed. As far as Yamada knew, they were still at war. As far as he knew, their mission was still valid. "I think," Yamada said carefully, "that men like us do not get to decide when the war ends." Tanaka looked up from the junction box. "Then what are we doing down here?" It was a fair question. Yamada did not have a fair answer. He thought about his old crew, the men who had burned in the I-class submarine.
He thought about the fishermen whose boats had been confiscated to build the wooden prototypes. He thought about the forests that had been cut down, the cypress groves that had stood for centuries, now hollowed out and shaped into weapons that would probably never work. "We are doing," Yamada said finally, "what we were ordered to do." Tanaka grunted and went back to work. The minutes stretched. The air grew heavier. Yamada checked his watch. 5 minutes had passed. 10. Tanaka was muttering to himself, twisting wires, trying to coax life back into the motor. Nakamura had closed his eyes and was praying silently, lips moving without sound. And then the knocking started again. This time it was different, not rhythmic, not repetitive. It sounded like something moving through the hull, scraping, dragging, as if the wood itself had joints and ligaments. Nakamura's eyes snapped open. "There," he breathed, pointing at the bulkhead. "Do you hear it?" I heard it, and I felt it, vibrating through the floorboards, through the helm controls, through my chest. Tanaka stopped working. All 3 men stared at the forward bulkhead, where the torpedoes were loaded, where the sound seemed to be coming from. "Commander, I need to tell you something." Yamada turned to him. His face was gray. "When we loaded the torpedoes yesterday, I noticed something. The Type 97 in the starboard tube, it was logged as defective, guidance system failure. It should not have been in the armory." Yamada felt ice crawl up his spine. "Why did you not report this?" "I did. The munitions officer told me to load it anyway. He said it did not matter. He said we were not coming back." A long silence. Then Nakamura spoke, his voice shaking. "Commander, the sound is not coming from the hull. It is coming from inside the torpedo." Yamada moved to the forward compartment, pressing his ear against the cold steel of the torpedo tube. And there it was, a faint mechanical ticking. Not knocking, ticking, like a clock winding down. "Tanaka," Yamada said, his voice very calm, "restore power, now!" Tanaka's hands moved faster. Sparks flew from the junction box. The motor coughed, sputtered, caught. The lights flickered on. The depth gauge sprang back to life. 32 meters, 33 meters. They were still sinking. Yamada grabbed the ballast release. "Emergency ascent, full speed!" But before he could pull the lever, the ticking stopped. The submarine went silent again. And then, from the torpedo tube, came a single, hollow thunk, like a firing pin striking an empty chamber. Nothing happened. No explosion, no fire. Just silence. Yamada, Tanaka, and Nakamura stared at each other in the weak electric light. The submarine hung motionless in the water, suspended between the surface and the abyss. And in that moment, Yamada understood. The torpedo had not been defective. It had been sabotaged. Someone in the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal, some engineer or officer who had stopped believing in the war, had deliberately removed the warhead and replaced it with a timing mechanism, a message, a warning, or maybe just a cruel joke. The radio crackled to life. A voice, distant and distorted by static, spoke in Japanese. "All units, cease combat operations. Repeat, cease all combat operations. By order of the Emperor, Japan has accepted the terms of unconditional surrender. The war is over." Yamada did not move. Tanaka let out a long, shuddering breath. Nakamura began to pry. The wooden submarine drifted silently through the dark water, carrying 3 men who were no longer soldiers, no longer warriors, just survivors. And for the first time in years, Yamada felt the weight of that word. Survivor.
August 15th, 1945, 6 o'clock in the morning, Yokosuka Naval Arsenal. The wooden submarine surfaced just as the sun broke over the horizon, painting Sagami Bay in shades of gold and red. Takeshi Yamada stood on the narrow deck, soaked in seawater and diesel fumes, watching the distant shoreline. Yokosuka looked different in the daylight, smaller, less threatening. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the naval yards, but the fires had gone out. The B-29s would not be coming back. Not today. Not ever. Tanaka and Nakamura climbed out behind him, blinking in the sudden brightness. None of them spoke. What was there to say? The war was over. They had survived. The wooden submarine had not killed them, though it had tried. Or perhaps it had been trying to save them all along, by failing, by breaking down, by refusing to become the weapon it was designed to be. A small patrol boat approached from the harbor, flying a white flag. Not surrender, ceasefire. The sailor aboard looked young, maybe 17. He shouted across the water, asking if they had heard the Emperor's broadcast. Yamada nodded. The sailor looked relieved. "You are ordered to return to base and stand by for decommissioning. All experimental units are to be scrapped immediately." Yamada looked back at the wooden submarine. It floated low in the water, listing slightly to starboard, its cypress hull dark with seawater and covered in barnacles, despite having been launched only hours ago. It looked ancient, as if it had been submerged for decades, as if it had always been part of the ocean. "What will happen to it?" Yamada asked. The sailor shrugged. "Same as all the others. They will burn it or sink it. The Americans are coming to inspect the base next week. Command does not want them to see this." Yamada understood. The wooden submarine was evidence of desperation, of failure, of a nation that had run out of steel and fuel and time, and had turned to forests and fishermen and ghosts to fight a war it could not win. Burning it would erase that shame. Sinking it would bury the memory. But Yamada did not want to forget. He climbed back down into the submarine one last time. The interior smelled different now, less like resin, more like the sea. Water had leaked through a dozen small cracks in the hull, pooling in the bilge, soaking into the wooden ribs. The motor was silent. The torpedoes were still loaded, one functional, one sabotaged. Yamada opened the torpedo tube and stared at the defective Type 97. Someone had scratched words into the casing with a knife. 4 characters in kanji. Mori wa oboete iru. The forest remembers. Yamada traced the letters with his finger. He did not know who had written them. Maybe the engineer who had removed the warhead. Maybe the carpenter who had shaped the cypress planks. Maybe the trees themselves, speaking through the hands of men who no longer wanted to kill. The forest remembers. Remembers what? The lives it sheltered before it was cut down? The monks who prayed beneath its branches? The rain and wind and centuries of silence? Or maybe it remembered the men who had been forced to climb inside it, to breathe its air, to trust their lives to something that had never been meant to hold them. Yamada closed the torpedo tube and climbed back outside. Tanaka was already in the patrol boat. Nakamura stood on the deck of the wooden submarine, looking down at the water. "Commander?" Nakamura said quietly. "Do you think it knew?" "Knew what?" "That the war was ending, that we did not have to die." Yamada looked at the submarine, at the cypress hull, at the way the sunlight caught the grain of the wood, revealing patterns that looked almost like script, almost like prayers. "I think," he said, "that it knew before we did." They left the submarine drifting in the bay. By the time they reached shore, it had already begun to sink. Slowly, gently, settling into the water like a tired animal lying down to rest. Yamada watched it disappear beneath the surface, the wooden hull submerging one last time until only the periscope remained visible, a single glass eye staring up at the sky. then that too was gone. Yamada never saw it again. The wooden submarine was never salvaged. It was never documented in official records. Years later, when historians asked about Japan's experimental vessels, no one mentioned the Type U-1. The blueprints were burned, the engineers were reassigned, the carpenters went back to building houses and temples. The forests grew back, slowly, over the stumps where the cypress trees had been cut down. But Yamada remembered. He kept a small piece of wood in his pocket for the rest of his life, a splinter from the helm, carved from hinoki cypress, smooth and warm to the touch. When people asked him about the war, he would take it out and run his thumb across the grain. And he would say, "I once served aboard a submarine made of wood. It should not have worked, but it did. It kept us alive just long enough to see the sunrise." He never told them about the knocking, about the sabotage torpedo, about the message carved into the steel. He kept those secrets the way the wood kept its rings, layer upon layer, sealed inside, growing heavier with time. And sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the wind moved through the trees outside his window, Yamada would hold the splinter of wood to his ear, and he would listen. Because the forest remembers, and so do the men who lived inside it. Even if it was only for a night, even if it was only long enough to survive.